The doors of the only lit building in Larkspur shut against her with a sound like a coffin lid, and the bolt slid home on the other side. And that was that. Etta stood in the freezing slop of the street and understood, the way a body understands weather, that no one else was coming. Her boots had given up an hour back. The left sole had peeled at the toe and let the meltwater in, and now her foot was a cold stone. She dragged at the end of her leg. She'd been walking the boardwalk since dusk, asking after work, after a room, after a Christian soul, and the answer at every door had been the same lowered eyes and the same soft no, and then the lamps had started going dark, up and down the street, like somebody pinching out a row of candles. She had 11 cents. She'd had more than that too. Mornings ago, before the woman on the stage with the kind face, and the peppermints had unstitched the lining of Etta's satchel while she slept and taken the rest. She'd woken to the woman gone at a water stop, and the driver shrugging, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, which she supposed it was. The cold came up out of the mud and into her like something with intent. She backed against the plank wall of the assay shed, where the wind couldn't get a full run at her, and pressed her hands flat to her own ribs and told herself she would not cry, because crying took heat and she had none to spend. Down the boardwalk a man came on, unhurried, his weight knocking the planks. In a town like this, a woman alone in the dark was a thing to be picked up off the ground, and she knew it, and her hand went into her coat pocket and closed around the little folding knife she used to trim telegraph paper. It wouldn't have stopped a determined dog, but it was hers, and it was steel. The man stepped down into the street, and he was enormous, built wrong for the stunted town around him, a head taller than the awning posts. He wore a long coat of some heavy hide gone bald at the elbows, and he didn't so much as glance her way. He was loading sacks into the bed of a buckboard hitched to a pair of big-footed draft horses. And he handled the hundredweights like they were bread loaves, and the horses stood patient with their breath, smoking up white around their ears. She must have made some sound, a tooth chatter or a shiver, because he stopped. He turned his head and looked at her across the dark. His face was all weather and brown beard, and a pair of pale eyes that took her in without heat or hunger or much of anything she could name. He looked at her the way you'd look at a fence post, leaning the wrong way, something out of True that you'd have to deal with eventually. "Store's shut," he said. His voice came up out of somewhere deep. Gravel turned over slow. "I know." He pulled a canvas over the sacks and lashed it down with 2 turns, and a hitch she couldn't follow, his hands working quick and sure in the cold. Then he just stood there a moment, letting the sleet collect on his hat brim, and he looked at her ruined boots, and the frozen mud crusting her hem, and the way her whole body was knocking like a loose shutter. "You'll be dead by morning against that wall," he said, not unkind, just true, the way a man reads a sky. "I'll manage." He breathed out through his nose, near to a laugh and not one. He walked to the front of the team and ran a hand down the near horse's neck, checking the collar, and she felt the whole night tip, because he was leaving. The last warm-blooded thing on the street was about to climb up and drive off, and she was going to die in Larkspur with 11 cents in her pocket. "Wait," it came out of her thin. He paused with his hand on the lines. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words tasted like ash, and she hated every one of them. He stood a long moment. He didn't soften, exactly. He just seemed to decide. He came back and dropped the tailgate, and it banged down against its chains. "Get up then," he said. "There's stew on at my place. You're shaking hard enough to throw a shoe." It wasn't a kindness offered. It was a thing stated, the way you'd say the creek was up or the moon was full. She stood there with her hand still around the little knife, and thought of every story she'd ever heard about men who lived alone past the end of the road. And then the wind reached down inside her coat again, and pressed itself into the very middle of her, and she thought, well, if he meant to kill her, at least it would be somewhere with a roof. She dragged herself to the wagon. He took her satchel from her, frowned at how little it weighed, and set it under the seat. Then he put one hand under her arm and lifted her into the bed like she didn't weigh much more than the satchel. And the grip of him was enormous, and, entirely without interest, the way a man handles freight. Before he got up, he went to the horses and checked each foot, lifting them one at a time, and knocking the packed ice out of the frogs with the back of a hook, talking low to them in a voice he didn't waste on her. Only then did he climb to the seat and chuck them forward, and the buckboard groaned, and they pulled out of Larkspur into the dark and the deepening snow. The road climbed. She knew it from the way the cold sharpened and thinned, and from the trees crowding closer, until their snow-loaded branches dragged the canvas with a sound like cloth tearing. She kept her eyes on the wall of his back. He sat hunched against the weather, never hurrying the team, clicking his tongue now and then, slapping the lines easy across their rumps when the grade steepened. A small lantern swung off the wagon box, and through the shadows of the trees, leaping and stretching across the snow. "What do they call you?" She got out, and the wind took it, and she didn't think he'd heard. A while later, without turning, "Roan, not Etta," she offered. He didn't answer that. They rode another hour in a silence broken only by harness creak and hooffall gone soft in the new snow. Her feet had quit hurting, which frightened her more than the pain had, because she'd worked a telegraph key through 3 Dakota winters, and she knew what it meant when a cold thing stopped complaining. "How much farther?" she said. "Horses smell the barn." "Not long." He was right. The trees broke, and the wagon swung into a clearing, and there was the low, square shape of a cabin with a steep roof shedding snow, and a thread of smoke standing up straight off the chimney into the windless dark, and behind it the bulk of a barn bigger than the house. Lamplight, banked low, glowed orange in one window. He hauled the team up to the barn first, not the house. He set the brake and climbed down stiff, favoring his right leg with a hitch she'd notice more later, and came around and dropped the tailgate. "Down," he said. She tried. Her legs were sticks of wood. The knees buckled the second they took her weight, and she pitched forward, and he caught her by the arm before she hit that vice grip again, and she heard him breathe out, "put upon," the same sound he'd made when she'd refused him on the street. "Feet quit on you," he said, and it wasn't a question. He looked at the barn, and the horses, and her foolish foot turned in at the wrong angle, and made his arithmetic. "House first." He gathered her up, one arm behind her knees and one across her back, and she grabbed his neck on instinct. He smelled of wet wool and pine pitch and cold iron. He carried her up 3 plank steps, shouldered the heavy door, and set her down in a tall rocking chair near the hearth where the coals were banked low and red. "Stay put," he said. "Don't go near that fire with those feet. Boots off, slow." And then he went back out into the snow. She heard him at the barn a long time, the horses' iron shoes ringing on the floor, the slosh of water, the heavy doors, the low run of his voice. She sat in the failing warmth and worked at her frozen laces with fingers that wouldn't answer, and she had her boots half off when he came back. Stamping snow, his beard rhymed white, looking like something carved out of the storm. He shut the door and dropped a bar across it. He crossed to her without a word, knelt with that hitch in his leg, knocked her clumsy hands aside, and worked the wet knots loose with a quickness that startled her. He peeled the boots off and the soaked stockings after, and she shut her eyes, mortified past speech at the blue-white of her own bare feet in a stranger's hands. "Don't crowd the fire," he said, setting the boots by the door. "Thaw too fast, and it'll feel like the devil's threading needles through you. Slow's better." He built the fire up and hung an iron pot back over it on its hook, and the smell of it filled the room. Onion and salt pork and beans that had plainly been going since morning, soft and ready, none of your raw split peas thrown in to chew. He cut 2 thick heels off a loaf and laid them on a hot stone to toast. The cabin came up out of the dark as the flames took. A cast stove in one corner, shelves jarred and crocked, with put-up food, harness and traps on the rafter pegs, and against the far wall one narrow cot under a heavy hide, one bed. She saw it, and her stomach went tight, and she pulled her arms around her knees. He filled a tin bowl and put it in her hands, with a heel of bread laid across the top, and the heat of it burned her palms, and she didn't let go. He took his own, and sat on a stump on the far side of the hearth, and ate without looking to see whether she liked it. She meant to be polite about it. She got one careful spoonful down, and then something in her broke its tether, and she ate like an animal, fast, both hands, mopping the bowl with the bread, and not caring how it looked, and when she finally surfaced, the bowl was clean, and she was breathing hard, and her chin was slick, and there was Roan watching her over the rim of his own with those pale eyes. The shame climbed up her neck. "I'm sorry I haven't eaten," he finished, and looked back down at his food. "Ain't a sin." He gave her more. She made that bowl last a little longer. When it was done, and the fire had got real heat into the room, the warmth and the weight of food in her hollowed-out belly came down on her like a hand pressing her into the chair, and she looked at the one cot, and looked at him. "Where do I sleep?" she said, and braced for it, because here it would come, the price of the ride and the supper. He set his bowl on the table, and went to a cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and came back with a great heavy quilt, sewn out of mismatched squares, and dropped it across her lap so it nearly knocked her wind out. "Chair," he said, "or the floor by the hearth. Floor's harder, but it holds the heat longer. And you?" "My bed." He said it, like she'd asked whether the sun came up east. He barred the door once more, checked it, and blew out the lamp, and the room went down to the red of the coals. She heard him pull off his boots, and the rope springs of the cot complain under him, and then his breathing settling slow and even. She sat clutching the quilt to her chest. She listened to the wind hunt around the eaves. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't asked her a single thing, and for the first time since she'd climbed onto that stage 2 days and a whole life to go, a tear got loose and ran hot down through the grime on her face, and she pulled the quilt over her head and curled up small in the chound. Not out of fear, but out of the terrible, swamping knowledge that, for this one night, she was safe. Morning came in mean. It hit the frost-furred window in a flat white glare, and she woke with her neck wrenched sideways against the chair back, and for 3 full seconds had no notion where she was. Then the throb in her feet told her, and the rest came after. The fire had burned down. Roan was already up, his back to her at the table, working a whetstone in slow circles over the curve of an axe. Scrape, lift, the cold in the cabin was a living thing. "Coffee's on," he said without turning. "It's stout. Don't expect much from it." She got up. Her feet had gone tender and swollen and mottled, and the first step put a knife up her heel. She limped to the stove and poured a cup of something black as creek mud and drank it, scalding and grateful. She caught sight of herself in the dark window glass. Her hair come down in greasy ropes, her good wool dress gone to ruin, mud to the knee, and a smell coming off her of wet sheep and fear, and a hot wash of shame went through her, because there'd been a time, not so long back, when she'd kept her cuffs white and her boots blacked, and would not have let a stranger see her like this for the world. She wanted to be useful. She'd spent her life being useful, reading the wire faster than men twice her age, and the helplessness of the night before sat sour in her. She reached for the dirty skillet on the cold stove to scrape it, and her numb fingers fumbled, and the heavy iron pan hit the floor with a clang that went off in the small room like a shot. She froze where she stood. Her breath stopped. She waited for the thing that always came after a dropped pan. The raised hand, the cold voice, the long quiet that was worse than either. Roan set the whetstone down. He stood, the chair grating back, and crossed to her with his uneven gait, and she made herself small without meaning to. He bent and picked up the pan. "Hands are stiff yet," he said, not angry. Tired almost. "Cold still in 'em. You grab iron like that with froze fingers, you'll leave skin behind. Sit." He took the skillet to the basin and worked the grease off it himself, and she sat back down in the chair with her cup and felt the note being hit of it ring louder than any blow. By midday the weather closed its fist. It wasn't snow so much as an assault, the wind shrieking off the ridge and shouldering the log walls so the whole cabin seemed to flinch, and the snow driving sideways till it caked the glass solid white. The one room that had felt sparse the night before now felt the size of a buried box. She paced it. 3 steps to the table, 3 steps back. He sat on the floor mending a snapped trace, an awl, and waxed thread in his big scarred hands, working in a silence so total it set her teeth on edge. She'd grown up in the chatter of a wire office, the clack of the key, men shouting prices through the wall. Quiet, to her, had only ever meant something was about to go wrong. "Do you ever talk?" she demanded, the words tearing loose before she could stop them. He didn't look up. He pushed the awl through the thick leather. "When there's call to, there mostly isn't." A short, ugly laugh got out of her. "We're shut up in a box while the world ends, and you're sitting there like it's a Sunday." "It's winter," he said. "Comes every year. I am going to lose my mind." Her hands had balled into fists. "I can't hear myself think for the quiet, and my feet are on fire, and I smell like a thing died in this dress." He stopped. He laid the trace across his knee and looked up at her, and the pale eyes went over her slow, the fists, the white face, the wild tangle of hair. "You're alive," he said. "Yesterday you were set to freeze stiff against a wall. Today you're warm enough to fuss about a smell." He said it flat, without cruelty, and it took the legs out from under her. The fight ran out of her all at once and left her swaying. He breathed out that same put-upon sigh and got up. He went to the cedar chest and pulled out a flannel shirt, faded near to no color at all, smelling of lye, soap, and cedar, and tossed it to her so it hit her in the chest. "That dress is damp," he said, turning his back and going to the stove, jabbing at the coals. "Damp'll kill you in this air slower than the cold, but just as sure. Hang it by the fire. I'm not looking. Put the shirt on." She stood with it bunched in her hands. Every instinct she owned said keep your armor on, no matter how wet and heavy it sat. But the chill had got down into the marrow of her, and after a moment she turned to face the dark corner and worked the small, stiff buttons of her bodice loose with shaking fingers, and let the ruined wool fall in a sodden heap. She pulled his shirt on over her shift. It swallowed her whole, hem at her knees, cuffs past her fingertips. It was rough and warm, and it smelled of him, wood smoke and pine and clean sweat, and she stood inside it feeling more bared and more safe than she had any right to at once. "Better?" he asked, not turning until she draped the dress over the chair. When he did turn, he looked only at her face. "Yes," she said, to the floor. "Thank you." He gave one short nod and sat back down to his mending, and the quiet came back, but the teeth had gone out of it. That afternoon the light died early, smothered in the storm, and he lit the lamp, and the cold pressed in harder, fingering through the chinking. She sat close to the stove, with her knees drawn up inside his shirt, and watched him clean a long lever rifle, strip and wipe and oil, patient as a stone. She saw the scar then, a thick pale rope of old-healed flesh running up his forearm and on under the rolled sleeve, and a hitch in how he sat that matched the hitch in how he walked. He caught her looking. He didn't cover it. "Horse," he said. "Green colt, 6 years back. Went over backward on a switchback above the rim, came down on top of me, crushed the leg. Took me most of a day to drag myself off that mountain." He set the rag down, healed crooked, walks crooked now. "Worth it, I reckon. Beat the colt, being worth it." "It was a terrible thing," said Plain, the way another man might mention rain. "You never thought to go on down?" she said. "Live somewhere easier, safer." He looked at her, and the lamplight caught something amber down in the pale of his eyes. "Safer where? Towns are full of men. I've yet to meet the mountain that wanted to own a person." He went back to the rifle. "Cougar just wants to eat. Man wants to keep you." The word went into her like a splinter and settled. She looked away into the coals and saw, in the twisting of them, a face she'd worked 2 days to outrun. Crane's smooth-shaved jaw and gold watch chain, and the smile that never once reached his eyes, and the way his soft white hand had closed around her throat, the night she'd told him she'd not be signing over her father's last shares, that she'd not be his to wind up and set on a shelf. Her fingers went up to the collar of the borrowed shirt, without her telling them to. The bruises were hidden under it now, yellowing, but she could still feel the ghost of his thumbs. Roan saw the hand go to the throat. He saw the eyes go flat and far off. He'd seen that look on hurt animals, and he'd seen it in a shaving mirror, and he didn't ask. What he did was get up and drag a tin tub out of the corner to the middle of the floor, scraping it over the boards, and set the 2 kettles he'd had heating into it, steam rolling up, then temper it with a bucket from by the door. "What are you doing?" she said, heart going hard. "You smell like the trail," he said, setting a square of yellow soap and a rough towel on the tub's edge. "Wash?" She stared at the steaming water, an impossible luxury, a thing out of a dream, sitting in the dead center of a one-room cabin with him not 10 feet off. "I can't. You're right here." He didn't roll his eyes, but the sigh said it for him. He took his big coat and his hat off the peg and shrugged into them. "You?" said the wind. She started, alarm spiking. "I've stacked wood in worse." He pulled the hat down tight. "There's more need splitting. Take your time. Bar the door behind me and call out when you're decent. Don't fall asleep in there and drown. I'd have a time explaining it." He lifted the bar, and the storm roared in and stole the warm out of the room and blew snow halfway across the floor, and then he was gone into the white and the door shut, and she heard him drop a beam across it from the outside. She was alone. She crossed to the tub and stripped off his shirt and the shift beneath, and stood a moment naked in the firelight, and without the wool she was a frail thing. Ribs too plain under the skin, the bruises from the stage's jolting blooming yellow and green along her hips, and the dark thumb-shaped mark on her collarbone that no scrubbing would lift. She sank into the water with a sound that was half sob. It was nearly too hot, and she didn't care. The heat got into her and loosened every clenched muscle and drew the deep chill up and out, and she wept a little for the plain animal relief of it. And then she took up the harsh soap that smelled of nothing but itself, and scrubbed until her skin went pink, the mud off her legs, the grime off her neck, the cold sweat of 2 days' terror off her chest, and ducked her head and worked the soap through her hair till it squeaked. When the water turned grey and tepid, she stood and dried fast teeth going, and pulled the damp shift back on and his shirt over it, and told her hair as best she could. She felt scrubbed down to something new. Then she stood at the door with her hand over the wood, and a strange tight ache came up in her chest, thinking of him out there in the killing dark on the far side of a beam he'd dropped, so she could be alone. She pounded the door. "I'm done." The bar scraped. The door shoved in against a foot of new snow, and he came stamping inside, caked in ice to the shoulders, frost in his eyebrows, looking like a thing winter had made and forgotten to finish. He leaned his weight on the door to force it shut and barred it, and he didn't look at her right off. He shed the frozen coat and knocked the snow from his boots. "You'll be froze through," she said quietly. He turned. His face was grey-pale with cold, the cheeks gone dark red. He looked at her. Face washed clean, dark hair, drying in clean waves over the shoulders of his shirt, not a muddy stray off the street anymore. And then he took the tub by its handles, hauled it to the door, cracked it open, and pitched the grey water out into the snow, and shut the storm out again. "Wood stacked," he said, going to the fire, and holding his big numb hands to it. He didn't look at her again. "Get some sleep." The storm didn't break. It dug in and ground on until day and night ran together. On the 3rd morning, the chill she'd carried in her bones since the stage finally came due. It started small, a dull ache low in her back that spread until her muscles went to water and her joints to broken glass. She sat hunched in the chair under the quilt, shivering. though her skin had gone hot and tight, and she clamped her jaw to keep the teeth from rattling, because the man had troubles enough without a sick stray dying in his house. A dry tickle climbed her throat. She swallowed it down. She took a shallow breath, and it snagged, and she coughed. A harsh, tearing wet sound that ripped through the quiet. Roan's hand stopped on the strop. He set the razor down slow, wiped his fingers and turned. She coughed again and folded over it, a spike of pain going up behind her ribs, her eyes running. When she got her breath, he was standing over her, and he pressed the back of one rough hand to her forehead, and it felt blessedly cool against the burn of her. "Fever," he said, jaw going tight. "I'm all right," she rasped. "Just caught a draft." He didn't bother arguing the lie. He went to the shelves and took down a jar of stripped grey bark, pinched some into a cup, and poured boiling water over it. "Bed," he said. "I won't take your bed." His voice didn't rise, but the iron under it pinned her where she sat. "You die in that chair. I've got to dig a hole, and the ground's froze hard as a skillet. I'm not of a mind to, so." It was so flatly practical it walked straight past her pride and left it standing. She nodded, weak, and tried to rise, and her legs went, and he caught her up the way he had that first night, and laid her on the narrow cot, and drew the heavy hide over her, and it smelled of dust and musk and him. He held the cup to her lips. The tea was bitter past anything, earthy, coating her, tongue with ash, and she gagged and pushed at it, and he held it steady against her bottom lip until she'd swallowed every foul drop. Then he set the cup down, took up his coat, and went out to see to the stock, telling her over his shoulder to stay under the hide. The next day went by in pieces. She floated in and out of a heat that bent the room and a cold that shook the cot. She dreamed of the stage's endless jolting, and of Crane's gold watch snapping shut, and of mud rising up her chest to her chin. She thrashed and kicked the hide off, and fought for air that came too thin. Hands caught her wrists. Easy. She came up out of it. The cabin was dark, but for the banked coals. Roan sat on a crate by the cot with a bowl of melted snow in his lap, wringing out a rag, and he laid the cold of it across her brow and wiped the sweat from her. She turned her face into the cool of his hand, and the shirt's collar slipped down off her shoulder. His hand stopped in the air. The dark marks on her collared bone and the base of her throat stood out plain in the low red light. The shape of a man's fingers, the deep print of a thumb, pressed into the pale of her skin. She felt the stillness in the room before she understood it. The fever fog tore enough for her to know. Her collar had fallen open, and panic went through her, and she snatched the hide up to her chin and pulled it tight, her breath gone shallow and quick. Roan didn't move. He looked at the place the bruises had been. The muscle in his jaw worked under the beard. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask had she earned it. He lowered his hand slow and dipped the rag back in the snowmelt. "Fever's turning," he said, low, the voice scraping deep in his chest. "Sleep." He laid the cold cloth careful across her forehead, and he didn't touch her neck again that night. He sat in the dark on the crate, watching the barred door, and his hand rested easy near the long rifle leaned against the wall. The quiet woke her, a vast hollow quiet that made her ears ring, because the wind had finally quit shrieking at the walls. She opened her eyes to a flood of blinding clean white off the snow outside, and her head pounded, but the terrible heat had gone out of her. Her skin was cool and damp and her own again. Roan stood at the stove, his back to her, the smell of strong coffee and frying side meat anchoring her to the world. He'd been up. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the grey exhaustion carved around his eyes, when he turned and brought her a tin plate without asking how she felt, only expecting her to eat. She ate. It tasted like being given her life back. She set the plate down and pulled the hide up across her lap and ran her fingers through the coarse fur of it and said, "To the room." His name was Crane. Roan didn't stop eating, didn't look at her. He chewed and swallowed and stared at the stove door. "Didn't ask," he said. "I know. But you saw." He laid his forearms on his knees and laced his thick fingers together. I see a lot of things. Most of it's not mine to ask after." So she told him about her father, who'd gone broke chasing silver shares that came up dust, about Crane, who bought the debt the way you'd buy a fence line, and came to the house and said the slate could be wiped clean. All she had to do was wear his ring and pour coffee for his business friends and look pleasing while she did it. She'd thought she could. She'd thought it was a kind of arithmetic. But Crane hadn't wanted a wife. He'd wanted a clock he could wind and a dog he could kick when the markets ran against him. She told it, dry and fast, the whole of it spilling out at once, and she touched the collar of his shirt. When she got to the night, she'd told him no and felt his hand close on her throat, and how she'd packed one satchel and taken the petty cash from his desk drawer while his brandy, and bought a seat on the first stage running west into high country, not caring where it stopped. So long as it stopped where he wouldn't follow. The quiet that came after wasn't the cramped kind from the first day. It had the weight of true things in it. Roan unlaced his fingers and rolled himself a cigarette, slow and careful. "A man that puts his hands on a woman's neck," he said, touching a match to it, "isn't a hard man. He's a scared one, throwing his weight around so nobody clocks how little of it's real." He blew a thin line of smoke at the rafters. "He looking for you?" A cold drop went through her. "He has the money to pay men who find things." Roan nodded once, untroubled. He pinched the cigarette out between his bare fingers and dropped the stub in his shirt pocket. "Pusselby drifted shut clear to Thor," he said, and the certainty in it was the certainty of the mountain itself. "Nobody's tracking anything through that. He sends men in the spring. They've got the one canyon to come up, and it's a long, narrow climb, and folks can be seen coming a good ways off." He looked at her with those pale flint eyes. "Won't anybody come up that draw I don't know about? You're safe here." He didn't offer pity. He didn't make a speech about her honor. He offered her geography and a clear field of fire, and it was the most comforting thing anyone had ever said to her in the whole of her life. "Why?" she said, her eyes burning. "You don't know me. I'm no use to you up here. I can read a wire faster than any man you'll meet, and out here that's worth less than the snow. I dropped your skillet. I can't even." "You sat 2 days against a wall with a paper knife in your pocket," he said, getting up, taking his gloves off the table. "That's not nothing. You just don't know the work yet. Work can be learned." He pulled the gloves on, got to dig out the team and break a path to the barn. Stay in. Rest. He went out into the blinding day and the clean cold, and the door shut, and she sat in the smell of coffee and old smoke, and under it the sudden green smell of hope. The thaw took 3 days. The sun came down fierce off the rim and turned the snowpack to glare and slush, and the world ran with the sound of water off the eaves, through the swollen creek behind the barn, dropping in wet thuds off the pine boughs. Her strength came back slow. By the second day she'd quit the cot and taken over the stove, learning by burnt fingers and scorched biscuits how to ride the heat of the coals. He let her. He didn't hover. He split wood and cleared the roof and rode the trapline and came in at dusk, smelling of resin and coal. They moved around one another in a careful, quiet pattern, and the silence between them had stopped being a cage and become a kind of shared room. But as the snow pulled back off the trail and showed the dark, muddy rut of the road dropping away down the mountain, a dread settled into her that she couldn't name out loud. The road was opening. The world was coming back. On the 4th morning he didn't ride out to the traps. She stood at the window wiping the fog off the glass and watched him back the big horses into the traces and hitch them to the buckboard, the snow in the yard gone to churned mud, and her stomach dropped clean out of her. It was time. The fever had broken, the road was clear, and her welcome had run its length. She was a stray he'd kept out of the weather, and the weather was done. She had nothing to pack. The ruined dress lay folded on the chair, unwearable. She stood there in his great faded shirt and her stiff, dried boots with her hands shaking. The door creaked in. He came in stamping mud off the threshold and didn't take off his coat. He stood filling the doorframe, blocking the light. "Team's hitched," he said, his voice gone flat and stripped. She gripped the back of the rocking chair until her knuckles whitened. She would not cry. She'd lived through Crane. She'd lived through the blizzard. She'd lived through this. She made her mouth into a tight, bright smile that felt like it would crack her face. "I haven't much to gather," she said. She took her ruined coat off the peg. "What do I owe you? For the food, the medicine?" He looked at her, at the rigid spine, the lifted chin, the last poor scraps of the armor she'd carried up the mountain. "Stage comes through Larkspur tomorrow noon," he said slow. "Road's dry enough to make it down by dark. Old man at the assay shed owes me a turn. He'll let you sleep there." She nodded, stiff. "Thank you." "For everything." She started for the door and waited for him to step aside. He didn't. He stood planted, an immovable wall of hide and shoulder. "Move, please," she whispered, and the bright false smile broke apart. He pushed his hat back off his brow with one finger. "Told you the stage was running," he said. "Didn't tell you to get on it." She went still. The air in the cabin held. "What?" He looked away off at the cold stove, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked unsure of himself, shifting his weight, the boards creaking under him. "It's quiet up here," he said, low, the words coming hard like turning stone. "I've kept it that way on purpose a long while. Don't much care for company, as a rule." He brought his eyes back to her. "But I don't seem to mind yours." It was clumsy and plain, and had no poetry in it at all. "Roan? Life up here's hard," he said, cutting across her, and he wasn't pleading. He was laying out the terms. "Winters run long, the meat's tough, and the work doesn't quit. There's no fine dresses, and no piano, and no soft anything." He put out one great scarred hand, palm up, into the space between them, and he didn't take hold of her, only offered the room. "But you'll never once be cold. You'll never go to bed hungry, and no man living is ever going to lay a hand on your throat again. Not while I've got breath and a clear shot up that canyon." He stood there, entirely bare in his big quiet way. "You've got the choice of it, Etta. The road's open." He tipped his head toward the stove. "Or you set your boots by the door, and there'll be coffee on come morning. And we'll see about teaching you to make biscuits that don't bounce." She stared at the open hand. She thought of the stage and the long string of towns after it, and the endless looking back over her shoulder. She thought of the cold mud of Larkspur, and the bolt sliding home in the dark. Then she looked at the iron skillet on the cold stove and at the great hitch-legged man who'd carried her out of the snow and boiled bitter bark into her, and given her his shirt, and his silence and his only bed. She let the ruined coat slip out of her fingers. It hit the floor with a soft, dull sound. She didn't throw herself at him or weep. She only reached out and set her small pale hand down in the middle of his big calloused palm, and his fingers folded over it, rough and warm and steady as a hitching post sunk deep. "I expect I can learn the biscuits," she said, and a real smile, slow and quiet, came up over her face at last. The corner of his mouth moved, near to a smile and not quite one. He squeezed her hand once and let it go, and turned to the door, and pulled it open, and called out across the muddy yard for the boy who helped him in the warm months to come back up and put the team away. Then he hung his coat on the peg, and crouched at the hearth with that hitch in his leg, and began laying kindling. "Stove's gone cold," he said. "Best build it up. Beans take a while to come right." She crossed to the fire and took up the poker, and stirred the red coals, and the sparks went up the chimney bright and hot, and outside the water ran off the eaves in the thaw. The winter wasn't through with them, but the cold had gone out of the house, and she found she wasn't afraid of what the spring might bring up the canyon, because for the first time in a long time she wasn't waiting on it alone.